2,800 years ago, a blind poet known as Homer would craft one of the greatest stories ever told. His first work, the Iliad, recounted the Trojan War, a conflict of gods and men, heroes and kings, ending with one of the most infamous tricks in history, the Trojan Horse. But Homer would not end the tale with the fall of Troy. Instead, he would turn his attention to the man behind the deception, a man famed for his cunning above all else, Odysseus. And so with his second epic, the Odyssey, Homer would tell the story of a hero's desperate attempt to return home, a journey across stormy seas and cursed islands where monsters, witches, and vengeful gods would stand in his way. At the heart of it all was a simple desire. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had been at war for 10 long years. He had led men into battle, commanded fleets, and brought about the fall of Troy with his brilliant plan to smuggle soldiers inside a wooden horse. Yet through it all, he wanted only one thing: to return to his island homeland, to see his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, who had grown into a young man in his absence. That was his true victory, not in battle, but in reuniting with the family he had left behind. But the gods of Olympus do not give gifts so easily. While some favored Odysseus for his cleverness and courage, others despised him for his arrogance and defiance. The sea god Poseidon in particular, father of storms and earthquakes, would come to see Odysseus not as a hero, but as an enemy. And so, what should have been a short voyage home became a 10-year ordeal, a story of survival, deception, and the heavy price of pride. With Troy in ruins, Odysseus gathered his fleet and set sail for Ithaca. Their first stop would be Ismarus, home of the Cicones, allies of Troy. At first, the Greeks overpowered the town, taking supplies and treasure. But their victory was short-lived. Reinforcements soon arrived, and Odysseus's men were driven back to their ships, many of them cut down by the Thracian warriors. Already, the voyage home had begun with bloodshed and loss. Still determined, Odysseus pointed his ships toward Ithaca, but as they sailed around the coast of Greece, a storm blew them far from their course. Days turned into weeks, and the men grew weary and hungry until they spotted land. This was the island of the Lotus-Eaters, a place that seemed calm and inviting. The locals offered the strangers their food, fruit from the lotus plant. It looked harmless enough, but Odysseus quickly realized its true nature. The lotus was no ordinary fruit. It clouded the mind, erased memory, and filled its victims with a blissful forgetfulness. Those who ate it no longer longed for home. They wanted only to stay on the island forever, lost in a drugged dream. Several of Odysseus's men would fall under its spell, sinking into a stupor and refusing to leave. Odysseus, horrified, had to drag them back to the ships himself. He forbade anyone from eating the lotus again and commanded his men to set sail immediately. They had escaped, but just barely. And the lesson was clear. Even in places that seemed peaceful, hidden dangers awaited. But worse was yet to come, for their next landfall would bring them face to face with one of the most terrifying creatures in all of Greek mythology, a Cyclops. Odysseus and his men had run low on supplies when they discovered a cave filled with sheep, cheese, and meat. They thought they had stumbled upon a shepherd's storehouse, but when the owner returned, they realized their mistake. This was Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant and the son of Poseidon himself. He sealed the cave with a massive stone and began devouring Odysseus's men, 2 at a time. Here, Odysseus's cunning would be tested. He could not move the stone by force, nor could he kill Polyphemus outright, for they would still be trapped inside. Instead, he offered the giant strong wine. When Polyphemus asked his name, Odysseus gave him a trick answer: nobody. The Cyclops drank heavily and soon collapsed in a drunken sleep. That was when Odysseus acted. He and his men sharpened a wooden stake, heated it in the fire, and drove it into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him. The giant roared in agony, calling for help. Other Cyclopes rushed to the cave, shouting, "Who is hurting you?" And Polyphemus cried back, "Nobody is hurting me!" Believing him safe, they turned away, leaving Odysseus's men hidden in the darkness. The next morning, as Polyphemus unblocked the cave to let his sheep out, he felt each animal to make sure no man escaped. But Odysseus had thought of everything. He tied his men to the undersides of the sheep, clinging to their wool, and in this way they slipped past the blind giant. They rushed to their ship and pushed off, finally free. But it was then that Odysseus made a fateful mistake. Overcome with pride, he called back to Polyphemus, revealing his true name. The giant prayed to his father Poseidon, calling for vengeance upon Odysseus, and with that the curse began. Odysseus would wander the seas for years, lose all his companions, and return home only after endless suffering. Already, the journey that should have taken weeks had turned into a struggle against gods and fate itself. And yet this was only the beginning. Ahead lay witches, sirens, monsters, and even the underworld itself. This was the price of cunning. This was the curse of Odysseus. With the curse of Poseidon now upon him, Odysseus would leave the land of the Cyclops, steering his single fleet into the unknown waters of the Mediterranean. Already he had suffered great losses, and yet his men still believed that the gods had not abandoned them. They hoped for safe harbor, for rest, for some sign that their journey was nearing its end. What they did not know was that their trials had only just begun. Their next stop would bring them to the floating island of Aeolia, a land ruled by King Aeolus, master of the winds. Unlike the hostile places they had seen before, this island was warm and welcoming. Aeolus would listen to Odysseus's tale, praising his cunning and offering him a gift that could shorten the long journey home. He presented a leather bag tied tightly with silver cord, inside which all the world's winds had been trapped, save for the gentle breeze that would guide them straight to Ithaca. Odysseus, grateful for the gift, placed the bag carefully in the corner of his ship. For 9 days and nights they sailed with favorable winds, and at last Ithaca itself came into sight. The men could see the distant hills, smell the smoke from familiar hearths, and feel the relief of 20 years of war and wandering finally coming to an end. But fate can be cruelest at the moment of triumph. Odysseus, exhausted, had fallen into a deep sleep. His men, eyeing the bag Aeolus had given him, whispered among themselves. They believed it contained treasure, gold and silver stolen from foreign lands, hoarded by their captain. Jealousy grew and greed took hold. Quietly, they untied the cord and opened the bag. At once, the winds burst free, roaring across the sea. A storm unlike any they had ever seen struck their ship, tearing them from the very sight of Ithaca and carrying them far, far away. When Odysseus awoke, it was to the screams of his men and the sight of his homeland vanishing on the horizon. The ship was blown back to Aeolia, where Odysseus threw himself at Aeolus's feet, begging once more for aid. But Aeolus saw the hand of the gods in this disaster. He knew that only a man cursed by Olympus could suffer such misfortune. Fearing divine wrath, he refused to help Odysseus again, casting him out and ordering him never to return. And so Odysseus set sail once more, his men silent with shame, his heart heavy with despair. Their next landfall would prove even more terrible. The fleet would come to the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals. At first, the harbor seemed calm, with high cliffs protecting it from the sea. Odysseus sent scouts inland to find food and water, but they soon stumbled upon the Laestrygonian king, who seized one of the men and devoured him on the spot. The rest fled, but their escape was short-lived. The giants poured from the hills, pelting the harbor with massive boulders. One by one, the ships were smashed apart, their crews dragged into the water and devoured. The sea turned red as Odysseus, watching in horror, realized there was nothing he could do. He cut the lines of his own vessel, steering frantically out of the narrow harbor while his men rowed for their lives. Behind them, the screams of their companions echoed across the cliffs until they were silenced forever. When at last the sea was calm again, Odysseus looked around and understood the full weight of Poseidon's curse. Of the many ships that had left Troy under his command, only one remained. The rest had been destroyed, their crews slaughtered or consumed. The once proud leader of a fleet was now the captain of a single battered vessel, carrying only a handful of survivors. Yet Odysseus did not give up. He would not abandon his hope of seeing Ithaca again. But even as he pushed forward, the gods were preparing trials more dangerous still, trials that would test his courage, his cunning, and even his soul. Ahead lay the island of a sorceress, a woman of beauty and deadly power, whose enchantments would threaten to strip Odysseus of everything he had left. Her name was Circe. Odysseus and his remaining men, weary and broken after the slaughter by the Laestrygonian giants, would drift across the endless sea until at last they reached a mysterious island. Here, hope would come in a dangerous form, for the island was ruled by Circe, the sorceress daughter of the sun god Helios. Her home was unlike anything the men had seen before. Tame lions and wolves, once ferocious predators, lay at her feet, charmed by her magic. From within her halls came the scent of rich food and spiced wine. Exhausted, Odysseus's men accepted her invitation to dine, but they would soon discover her hospitality concealed a deadly trap. Circe mixed into their meal a secret potion, and as they drank, their bodies twisted and transformed. One by one, Odysseus's men collapsed onto the ground, their voices fading into squeals, their hands turning to hooves. In moments, they had become pigs, snorting and writhing helplessly on the floor, while Circe looked on with cold amusement. Only one man had avoided the feast and managed to run back to Odysseus with the terrible news. Hearing it, Odysseus set off at once to confront the witch. But before he reached her halls, he was stopped by a figure of divine power. It was Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Knowing what awaited Odysseus, Hermes gave him a single stalk of a magical herb called moly. "Take this," he warned, "and Circe's potions will have no power over you." Armed with the herb, Odysseus strode into Circe's hall. She welcomed him as she had welcomed the others, offering him her enchanted drink. But when he drained the cup, nothing happened. Circe's eyes widened in shock as Odysseus drew his sword, pressing it to her throat. He demanded she restore his men to human form or face death. Trembling, Circe agreed, and the pigs at her feet rose up once more as men, shaken but alive. What began as a battle of wills soon transformed into something stranger still. Impressed by Odysseus's defiance, Circe offered him her bed, and together they would remain on her island for an entire year. Though his men longed to return home, Odysseus lingered, feasting, resting, and even fathering a son, Telegonus, with the sorceress. But eventually, the call of Ithaca became too strong to ignore. When Odysseus declared it was time to leave, Circe did not stop him. Instead, she offered him something far more valuable: advice. She told him that before he could reach his homeland, he must sail to the very edge of the world and enter the realm of the dead. There, he would find the shade of the prophet Tiresias, who alone could reveal the path forward. And so, Odysseus and his men sailed west until the sea turned black and the air grew still. At the entrance to the Underworld, they performed the rituals Circe had taught them, pouring libations and sacrificing animals to call forth the spirits. From the shadows of that dark land came countless souls, warriors and kings, mothers and children, all crowding around Odysseus, hungering for the blood of his offering. Then the blind prophet Tiresias appeared. He revealed the truth of Odysseus' curse, that Poseidon would never allow him to return home easily. He warned that the most dangerous trial still lay ahead, on the island of Thrinacia. where the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios grazed. If Odysseus's men harmed even a single one of the divine beasts, their doom would be sealed. Only Odysseus himself might survive, and even then, his return would come only after terrible suffering. But Tiresias was not the only shade to appear. Odysseus's mother, Anticlea, came forward, her form pale and sorrowful. She told him she had died of grief, unable to bear his absence. Overcome with emotion, Odysseus tried to embrace her, but she slipped through his arms like smoke, a reminder of the cruel distance between the living and the dead. Other shades would come too, fallen warriors from Troy, including Agamemnon, who told of his own betrayal and murder upon returning home, and Achilles, who confessed that he would rather be a poor farmer alive than the greatest hero among the dead. These encounters weighed heavily on Odysseus, each one a warning of the fragility of life and the price of glory. When at last the spirits retreated and Tiresias's prophecy was complete, Odysseus returned to his ship, shaken but resolute. He now carried with him the knowledge of what awaited, though it gave him little comfort. Ahead lay dangers that no mortal had yet faced and lived to tell, and among them, the most alluring and deadly of all, the Sirens. Armed with the prophecy of Tiresias, Odysseus and his men set sail once more. They carried the weight of warnings in their hearts, but the sea offered no mercy. Their first trial after leaving the land of the dead would come not from storms or giants, but from voices so beautiful that no man could resist. These were the Sirens. The Sirens' song was no ordinary music. It promised knowledge, beauty, and irresistible desire. Sailors who heard it were said to leap from their ships, swimming desperately toward the source, only to be dashed upon the jagged rocks that surrounded the Sirens' island. No one had ever resisted them, but Odysseus, ever cunning, would find a way. Remembering Circe's advice, he ordered his men to melt beeswax and press it firmly into their ears, sealing them against the deadly song. But Odysseus himself wanted something more. He wished to hear the Sirens' voices and live to tell the tale. So he commanded his men to tie him tightly to the mast of the ship. No matter what he said, no matter how much he begged, they were not to release him. As the ship drew closer, the air filled with melody. The Sirens sang promises of glory, whispering Odysseus' own name, tempting him with visions of knowledge beyond the gods themselves. He thrashed against his bonds, shouting for his men to release him, cursing them for their cruelty. But they could not hear. Their ears were blocked, their faces grim with focus. The ropes held, and the ship passed beyond the range of the song. Odysseus had done the impossible. He had heard the Sirens and survived. Behind them, the Sirens, knowing their fate was sealed, hurled themselves into the sea. Their voices would never claim another sailor again. Yet the triumph was short-lived, for ahead lay a narrow strait where two horrors waited. On one side loomed Scylla, a six-headed monster perched high upon the cliffs, her long necks ready to swoop down and snatch sailors from the decks. On the other side churned Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that could swallow an entire ship whole. To sail too close to Charybdis meant certain destruction, but to sail near Scylla meant sacrificing men to her insatiable hunger. Odysseus made the most agonizing choice of his journey. Following Circe's warning, he steered toward Scylla. Better to lose a few men than the entire crew. As they rowed past, Scylla struck. 6 heads darted down, each seizing a man and dragging him screaming into the dark. The rest of the crew rowed harder, their eyes averted, their hearts shattered. Odysseus himself could do nothing but watch, knowing their deaths were the price of survival. Though the men mourned, worse trials lay ahead. For at last, they reached the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god himself. Tiresias had warned them, do not touch the cattle. If they did, doom would fall upon them all. Odysseus repeated the warning again and again, swearing his men to obedience. But the gods are cruel, and fate is stronger than will. A storm blew in, stranding them on the island for weeks. Their supplies dwindled, their bellies emptied, and hunger gnawed at their minds. At last, when Odysseus fell asleep, his men broke their oath. Led by Eurylochus, they slaughtered the golden cattle of Helios and feasted on their flesh. The smoke of the roasting meat curled into the sky, carrying with it the scent of betrayal. When Odysseus awoke, it was too late. His men sat full-bellied, their faces grim with guilt. He wept, knowing the punishment that would come. And indeed, when they set sail, Helios demanded justice from Zeus himself. The king of the gods answered with fury. A thunderbolt split the sky, striking Odysseus's ship. The mast shattered, the hull tore apart, and the men were hurled into the sea. One by one, they drowned, their screams swallowed by the storm. When the sea was calm again, only Odysseus remained, clinging to the wreckage of his ship. Just as Tiresias had foretold, the curse was fulfilled. Alone, stripped of his crew, stripped of his ships, Odysseus drifted for 9 long days. His hair matted, his body broken, he floated endlessly across the waters, awaiting either death or deliverance. And on the 10th day, the waves cast him upon the shore of a lonely island where a goddess waited, one who would trap him not with chains or curses, but with love. Her name was Calypso. Shipwrecked and alone, Odysseus would wash ashore on the island of Ogygia, home to the nymph Calypso, daughter of the Titan Atlas. When she found him lying broken on the beach, Calypso nursed him back to health. But her care soon turned into something else. She fell in love with him, offering not only comfort, but the promise of immortality itself, if only he would stay with her forever. For 7 long years, Odysseus remained on her island, trapped not by force, but by temptation. Calypso offered him riches, beauty, and eternal life. Yet every night Odysseus sat on the shore, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart heavy with longing for Ithaca. He wept for Penelope, his faithful wife, and for Telemachus, the son he had not seen since boyhood. High on Olympus, the goddess Athena, who had guided Odysseus since the Trojan War, grew weary of watching her champion suffer. She pleaded with Zeus to intervene. At last, the king of the gods sent Hermes the messenger to Calypso with an order. She must release Odysseus and allow him to return home. Bitter though she was, Calypso obeyed. She helped Odysseus fell trees and build a raft, stocked it with provisions, and watched as he set sail once more. But Poseidon, still vengeful for his son Polyphemus, would not let Odysseus go so easily. He conjured another storm, shattering the raft and nearly drowning the weary hero. Only through the help of the sea goddess Ino, who gave him a protective veil, did Odysseus survive. Exhausted, he swam to the island of the Phaeacians, collapsing naked on their shore. It was here that Odysseus's fortune finally began to change. The Phaeacian princess Nausicaa discovered him, clothed him, and led him to her parents, King Alcinous and Queen Arete. They welcomed him into their halls, offering him food, drink, and shelter. When a bard began to sing of the Trojan War, recounting the story of the wooden horse, Odysseus could no longer contain himself. Tears streamed down his face as he listened to his own deeds retold, the weight of memory breaking through his composure. At last, he revealed his identity. He was Odysseus of Ithaca, the man who had wandered the seas for 20 years. The Phaeacians, moved by his story, vowed to return him home. They loaded a ship with treasure and set sail, and as Odysseus slept, they carried him across the sea and laid him gently upon the shores of Ithaca at dawn. After 2 decades, he was finally home. But his trials were not yet over. In his absence, suitors from across Greece had descended upon his palace, seeking to marry Penelope and claim his throne. More than 100 of them feasted in his halls, devouring his food, drinking his wine, and insulting his family. Yet through it all, Penelope had remained faithful, delaying her choice of a new husband by weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father. and secretly unraveling it each night so it would never be finished. With Athena's help, Odysseus disguised himself as a beggar and entered his own home in secret. There he was reunited with his son Telemachus, now grown into a man. Their embrace was filled with tears, but the joy of reunion would have to wait. For before Odysseus could reveal himself to the world, he would need to rid his halls of the suitors who had stolen his kingdom. Penelope, still seeking to delay her marriage, announced a contest. She would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined in a row. One by one, the suitors tried and failed. Not one of them had the strength to bend the bow. Then the beggar, Odysseus in disguise, asked for his turn. The suitors laughed, mocking him, but Penelope allowed it. With steady hands, Odysseus strung the bow with ease. He drew an arrow, fired, and sent it straight through all 12 axes. The laughter turned to silence. In that moment, Odysseus revealed himself. He cast off his disguise, his eyes blazing with fury, and turned his bow upon the suitors. With Telemachus at his side and the loyal servants Eumaeus and Philoetius aiding him, he struck them down one by one. The great hall echoed with the cries of the dying, until at last all the suitors lay dead, their blood soaking the very floors they had defiled. Peace returned to the palace. Odysseus, weary and scarred, at last embraced Penelope. For 20 years she had waited, resisting every pressure to remarry, holding on to the hope that her husband would one day return. And now, at long last, he stood before her. With tears in her eyes, she asked him where he had been all this time. Odysseus, smiling faintly through his own grief and relief, replied with a single line, one that captured the weight of his endless trials. "Where do I begin?